Alright, hey guys, and welcome to another video. As you can see, it's a nice, bright, sunny spring day, and I guess the weather affected my mood to really feel the need to want to make a YouTube video today talking about my top 10 favorite consoles of all time. And, the crazy part is I thought about it, I'm like, wow, I started YouTube back in 2008, over 10 years ago now, and I've never done a video ordering my top 10 game systems or consoles of all time, and I'm like, it's about time. I always avoided it because I never wanted to go through the excruciating process of actually having to try and order a top 10 list because I just thought to myself, that's just way too difficult for me. But over the years, I've played a lot more games for certain consoles. I feel more comfortable in making a top 10 list because I have more exposure to certain consoles that maybe I didn't in the past, and feel more comfortable excluding them or including them into this top 10 list. I kind of want to preface this by saying that this was not a quick thrown together list. I probably spent about a solid hour and a half, 2 hours, mulling over this, kind of like taking into account nostalgic values. Did I grow up with this console? Did I buy it at the launch? How much did the launch impact my memories of this console? How many games did I enjoy on this console? What was the importance and significance of when it came out in my lifetime for this console and the games? Stuff like that. And I also want you to keep in mind that my list is going to it's going to have some things that are not included that might shock some of you. It might have some things that are included that might be sort of like, what the heck is this guy thinking? But I want to remind you guys that my gaming tastes are quite different than most people. I tend to kind of favor some of the more obscure stuff. Not saying this list is going to be filled with obscure stuff, but just a heads up, okay? Don't flame me too much with your pitchforks in the comments. But anyway, what do you say we get started here with my number 10? And that is going to be the Sega Saturn. So Sega Saturn is a console that I did not have when I was growing up when it first initially came out. That is mostly because of the cost. Couldn't have everything, obviously. Kind of had to pick and choose. And while I grew up a Sega kid, which you might see will probably impact this list in more ways than just the Sega Saturn. When I eventually was able to acquire Saturn, I acquired it, I think, when I was around 13 years old. It was one of my earliest eBay purchases. I bought it on eBay, and I got it with a copy of Nights into Dreams, Panzer Dragoon, not Saga, Panzer Dragoon, and Sonic R. And those were the original three games that I wanted this console for so badly, because as a fan of Sonic, I really wanted Sonic R. And I was very much a fan of Sega exclusive games on the Saturn, such as Panzer Dragoon and Nights into Dreams, and all three of those titles lived up to everything that I could have imagined, especially Nights into Dreams and Panzer Dragoon. Sonic R was something that over the years sort of evolved into being one of my absolute favorite Sonic games. But the thing about the Saturn that's so memorable to me is my evolution with discovering the console, starting with those core three titles and eventually starting to work my way up to some of the exclusive RPGs, namely Panzer Dragoon Saga, which I actually found my eBay receipt in my email a while back. I managed to get a copy of that for $120, believe it or not. Crazy to think of the prices. Even back then, that was like the most I'd ever spent on a game. Today, that's practically nothing for that game. But it was sort of this journey of discovering the library, finding hidden gems like Astal or games like Mr. Bones, stuff such as that. And then the thing that is probably the most impactful for the Sega Saturn for me was it was the console that really introduced me to the world of import collecting. While I had dabbled in imports prior to having a Saturn, that is the console that really introduced me to the world of buying games from import sellers on eBay and discovering an entire world and library that, was previously inaccessible to me. And there were so many great, not too expensive at the time, exclusives for the Saturn, that kind of, especially shoot 'em ups. There were so many great Saturn import exclusive shoot 'em ups. Unfortunately, the Saturn library now is a bit expensive, a bit is maybe understating it. It's ridiculously expensive. So my collecting for the Saturn has pretty much come to a standstill and a stop. But my memories of that journey, of working my way up from the games that I had dreamed about having when I was younger, to now having some of the most obscure, expensive, and enjoyable Sega Saturn imports like Psychic Assassin, Taramaru being one of them. Absolutely love that game. It's just sort of it also it kind of goes hand in hand with my way of collecting, where I really honed in on the weird sort of exclusive games for that console, and I think the Saturn is one of the reasons why I love obscure games as much as I do today, because there were so many buried within the Saturn. I remember being at a convention, one of the early too many games conventions. I think it was, what was that, 2009 or something. And I remember finding a copy of Lunacy and being, sort of blown away by this weird, obscure Saturn adventure exclusive that I recently played through from start to finish a couple of years ago and absolutely loved it. But anyway, let's not get on a tangent too much about the Sega Saturn. What do you say we move on to number 9? Hopefully you guys are ready for this one, and I trust me, I'm not putting this on here as a way to try and stand out and as a way to be like, oh, he's just trying to be different by having this on his top 10 list. I put a lot of thought into this. My number 9 is actually the CDI, the Philips CDI. This is not trolling, this is not a late April Fool's joke. Yes, the CDI, put above many other consoles that you're going to be like, what the heck? How is X console not on this list, but the CDI is? So let me explain here. So the CDI is something that fascinated me for pretty much my entire time I'd been collecting since, and I would say I'd been collecting games, consciously collecting games after I discovered digital press, which was back when I was probably like 12 years old. The CDI had always fascinated me ever since I discovered that there were other people out there that were collecting games. However, the barrier to entry was they weren't easy to find at all locally, so it would have to be something I'd buy on eBay. The prices of CDIs on eBay have always been quite expensive because of shipping costs, and I just didn't feel like delving into that really weird library of games that at the time I thought was mostly just, oh, it's got the Zelda games, oh, it's got Mario or Hotel Mario, and that's about it, right? Like, that's what most people thought. But then the last several years I really made it a goal to get a CDI and delve into the library. And I have to say, it's the most fun that I have had looking into, and almost like an archival project where the analogy I can make is it's like I'm in a tomb and I'm like brushing away the dirt and everything, and you find these treasures out there that you never knew existed, and you almost feel like you're one of the only people in the world to discover these games, because they're so weird, so obscure. There's not many out there. Not a lot of people are willing to take the risk of investment into a CDI, let alone spend the money on some of these weird games that might not even classify as a game. But I took that chance. So I made it a goal of mine to research every CDI game that I possibly could in the library. So I had this very broad knowledge of every game that exists on the console. I tried to avoid games that were classified more as educational, like strictly for kids, or games with minimal interaction. So pretty much anything that let you press buttons to interact and do stuff beyond kids' educational games, I made it a goal of mine to try and buy that. So I did. And now I can say I have almost a full library, I'd say I'm like 90% complete of pretty much every game that would be worthwhile owning as a video game on the CDI. And through that process, I've found some amazing games beyond just what you would expect from the typical few, like the Zelda and the Hotel Mario. Some of which are a bit more well-known, some of which are not. Games like Burn Cycle, which is one of the more well-known CDI games, but it's just this amazing exclusive cyberpunk adventure game with full motion video that is unparalleled, because the CDI has some of the best technology, if not the best technology at the time, for full motion video, like light gun shooters and such. But just also finding games like this Lost Pyramid adventure game that was supposed to be a educational food game for kids about learning about the food pyramid, but it's actually this weird platformer where you play as a kid going through a pyramid. And it was actually pretty fully functional. It's like games like that, I'm like, wow, like I feel like I may be the only person within the past 10 years to even lay hands on this game and play it, which I'm sure is absolutely not true. But just that feeling of discovery and actually finding games, while fundamentally quite flawed, just that sort of research that went into it, and being able to appreciate the CDI games for what they were, reading articles on how hard it was to develop games on the CDI, let alone games that tried to pull off any form of 3D movement. So when you do play a game on the CDI that is trying to push the boundaries of the console, it was really something special. But I think what really pushed it over the top for me was because when I was really getting into CDI collecting was when um, I've been streaming on Twitch pretty much full time for the past 3 years, and that was right around when I started to get into the CDI quite heavily. So to be able to take and experience all of these games with a live audience, be able to share interactions with people, being able to laugh about these games, being able to be shocked over certain things that are good or bad about these games, and being able to do it in real time with other people watching, I think is what ultimately made the CDI make this list, is because of the process of discovering a library of games that almost the entirety of the video game collector scene out there deems as one of the worst consoles of all time, quote unquote. Nothing on there is worth your time. But I've played some really great stuff on there. The Apprentice, absolutely fantastic 2D platformer that, in terms of like Genesis and Super Nintendo platformers, The Apprentice would be up there in the list of like some of the best platformers from that time. Visually, perhaps even better than most Super Nintendo platformers, bar none. Just the CDI, you got to give it a chance. Okay, I'm a very big supporter of the CDI. It deserves looking into. The investment in getting the console is probably the scariest part. But then you got to just do your research, look for games out there. You got to do some legwork, all right? You got to put in some time to find some of the weird ones out there. And I'll just say, if you're a fan of light gun games, by the way, get that thing with a trackball, and you'll have a blast with the few games that are available. Don't hate me too much, okay? I'm sorry. I love my CDI. Moving on to number 8, and I could say a lot more about it, but we got to move on here. Moving on to number 8 is the Dreamcast. So the Dreamcast is one that I hesitated a little bit to put on my list because I was like, I don't have as many Dreamcast games as most people out there. I didn't play a horrible amount of Dreamcast games over the years, but then I thought to myself, man, that console came out during like the perfect time. Christmas of '99, getting a Dreamcast for Christmas with Sonic Adventure was like one of my fondest gaming memories of all time. And I was like, how can I not have the Dreamcast on there? And not just because of Sonic Adventure, not just because of getting it for Christmas, but it was during a time where, I couldn't get every game out there that I wanted, obviously. So the Dreamcast came at a time where renting video games was like at its peak for me. And the Dreamcast was sort of like this perfect marriage of arcade games that were perfect for rental. Most of the games were quite short. Replay value was high, but it's like, man, just go down to Hollywood Video, Blockbuster, or a local mom and pop shop and rent the Dreamcast game for a few days, and it was like you were in heaven because you felt satisfied. There were very few games that didn't feel like they were worth your time or money to rent, and most of them could be beat in a day or two. Of the games that I bought early on with my Dreamcast, having the holy trinity, as I like to call it, was Sonic Adventure, Power Stone. Absolutely love Power Stone. We need a Power Stone 3. Come on. And House of the Dead 2. Those were my 3 early games. And then I would rent games like Crazy Taxi. Crazy Taxi, amazing rental, right? Like who didn't rent Crazy Taxi and not have an absolute blast? That was like a multiple rental. I think I rented that twice. But you would rent stuff like that, and thank God for that, because renting games like Sonic Shuffle, though I'd like to talk about Sonic Shuffle at length at some point in the future, where I think that game is far better than I ever gave it credit for in the past. But being able to rent some games and maybe not like them too much, and return them back and get a different one. Pen Triathlon, another great rental on the Dreamcast. It was just such a good console to kind of have some friends over and play some multiplayer, because so many games supported multiplayer. And the thing about Dreamcast that I was like, this console really it deserves a spot on my list, because everything that you played on Dreamcast felt super unique to the Dreamcast. Anytime you played a Dreamcast game, it felt like a Dreamcast game. It didn't feel like a PS2 game. Heck, if you played a port of a PS2 game on the Dreamcast, that thing still felt like a Dreamcast game. I don't know what it was. Maybe it was because of just the feeling of the controller. the graphics, the menu, the sound, who the heck knows? All I know is everything felt absolutely unique to that console, and I think if you sat down and showed a montage of obscure games to people that spanned across the PS2, Xbox, Dreamcast, whatever, all right, maybe PS1. It's not fair to include the Xbox in on that, but it would kind of, if you showed them a montage of quick little snippets, and I think most people would be able to say, even though they've never seen some of these games before, they'd be able to pick out, that's a Dreamcast game, that's a Dreamcast game, that's a Dreamcast game. And something else that I used to love, I feel like the Dreamcast was sort of like the best console to play on a budget, because you'd get those Dreamcast magazines, at least I had a subscription to them, and then you play the demos and play, try out the games that you wanted to pick up or rent. And I don't want to make it like I didn't buy any Dreamcast games. I did, but my collection was quite small. I'd say maybe like 15 games for most of the time. Towards the end of when I stopped buying games new in the stores for Dreamcast, it sat around 15 games or so. Now I've been going back and trying to discover the library again, finding classics such as Illbleed and D2. Absolutely phenomenal horror games on there. So it's been a fun process, and I can't put it too high up on my list like some people might, but there's just so many different weekend memories with my Dreamcast that can't be understated. All right, so we're going to move on to number 7, and number 7 for me is going to be the Game Boy Advance. Game Boy Advance, and I didn't want to fill this list with like all Nintendo handheld stuff, so I kind of tried to keep it limited. Game Boy Advance for me started off a little slow. The original Game Boy Advance was great. Obviously, having no backlight, it was a little hard to appreciate some of the games that were on Game Boy Advance. But I think when the Game Boy Advance SP was released for me, that's what elevated Game Boy Advance games to a whole nother level for me. Being able to have that extra portability of the fold-down screen and just throw it in your pocket, throw it in your backpack, going to school. The backlight was amazing on it. And this was around the time where I was like really heavily into RPGs, so being able to play stuff like Riviera, The Promised Land, and Golden Sun, and even getting into genres that I had never really delved into too much before, sort of like with Advance Wars. But yeah, the Game Boy Advance library, what made it stand out to me so much at the time was just being mind blown about how much it felt like a portable Super Nintendo in my pocket. Visually, people that remember picking up a Game Boy Advance when it first came out, games like Iridion 3D were absolutely mind blowing. It's like, holy moly, I didn't think portable games could look this good. So yeah, it was just the wide variety of games, lots of platformers, lots of RPGs, even pulling off racing games like Mario Kart Super Circuit, F-Zero. Just such a wide assortment, plenty of first-party titles on there, plenty of third-party games that Game Boy Advance had to get a spot on my list. Moving on, though, is another Nintendo handheld, and this was really hard for me because, spoiler warning, the 3DS didn't make my top 10. Instead, I put the DS on there, but I had to say to myself, all right, you can play DS games on a 3DS. Why would I not just put the 3DS in the place of the DS, right? But then I said, well, the DS was just so significant, the console itself, compared to the 3DS for me, because when the DS came out, once again, another example of Nintendo just absolutely blowing my mind with never thinking it would be possible to play Super Mario 64 on a handheld and have it actually work fairly well. Which, by the way, for people that complained about controls in that game, there was a little nub that when you first bought the original DS, there was a little piece of plastic that would come on the wrist strap. You were supposed to use that little piece of plastic, that little like nub, on the touchscreen. You put your thumb on the touchscreen and you kind of just rotate it in place with the little piece of plastic. It would act as a virtual joystick. So everybody that complained about the controls in Mario 64 on the DS never played it probably with the way it was kind of intended, with that little piece of plastic. Try it. If you have a copy of the game and you still have your original DS or the wrist strap for that, give it a try. You'll be very surprised how it felt. So I was in that camp of absolutely loving that game. The launch, while most of the games were somewhat mediocre outside of Mario, was a very memorable launch for me. That was one of the earlier console launches where I had launchitis and, binge bought so many games for that thing. So it had a very memorable launch for me, really enjoying looking into the library of that when it came out. But then it was also the slow, steady buildup of realizing to myself, this console is more than just two screens. It's more than just a gimmick. Playing games like Yoshi's Touch and Go, where I felt like that was one of the earliest innovations for the DS where you really felt like having a second screen mattered. Where you would throw eggs with Yoshi on the bottom of the screen and they go all the way up top. I thought it worked perfectly. Games like WarioWare touched where it felt fun to use a stylus or to use the touchscreen to play these mini games. Games that kind of blew my mind, a little bit obscure, but Trace Memory, for those of you that played that, with some insane ideas for utilizing the DS beyond just a touchscreen and two screens. We're talking like stuff you would never even think of doing if you designed a game yourself with the DS. I don't want to spoil it too much, but let's just say that it made you really think with some of the puzzles in there that no other DS games, very few, really ever did. RPGs, I loved, obviously love RPGs. Games like the Etrian Odyssey series, Dark Spire, one of my favorite RPGs ever. Lost in Blue, a game that, once again, felt like it was home on the DS. That's a game that you really couldn't pull off on any other console because it felt like the touch controls really mattered. Playing games like Mario Kart DS and Diddy Kong Racing, being able to play them online. Let's not forget the fact that the DS was online. Being able to play games over Wi-Fi on a handheld was a huge deal, okay? But I think it's more so just the breadth and the scope of the DS's library. Even though it doesn't have too many like amazing, absolutely high standout titles for me, just the general overview of all the games I have, and you guys know I have quite a bit of DS games, paired with just the sort of appreciation of that thing as it aged, and eventually morphed into the 3DS. As much as I love my 3DS, I don't think the impact of the 3DS was quite as high as the DS was for me when it came out. So there you go. Moving on to number 5. So number 6 through number 10 was actually way more difficult. You would think it would be the opposite, right? Like ordering 1 through 5 would probably be the hardest thing of making a list like this. No, complete opposite. Number 6 through 10 was by far the hardest for me because I had to make so many difficult cuts of systems that I wanted to put in so badly but just couldn't. So these 1 through 5 was a lot easier for me. Not that it was like a walk in the park. I still had to think quite a bit about it. But number 5, perhaps a console that is on here mostly due to nostalgic reasons, I will completely admit that, is the N64. This is probably one of my consoles where over the years, I've played it less and less. And I think it mostly has to do in part with certain games have not aged well. Certain games I don't want to touch ever again because I don't want to destroy my original memories with said games. Games such as Super Mario 64, Ocarina of Time. That's about it. No, there's others, but I think what it is too, I want to keep some games in a time capsule where I don't want to ruin childhood memories with them. Also, some games visually have not aged well either. I will admit I'm not one of those people with, rose-colored glasses on where I'm like, oh man, the N64 games, they all still look amazing. No, there's some games that look pretty muddy. They look pretty horrible sometimes. Also, some gameplay-wise have not aged all that well. However, there's no denying the significance of the Nintendo 64. Getting that thing with a copy. I got it around the time when Diddy Kong Racing 64 came out. So I did not have this on launch. That was just, unfortunately, financially not possible for me or my family. It's just, another situation of can't have everything, right? But when I eventually got it with Mario 64, Wave Race, I had Doom 64 early on, Diddy Kong Racing, GoldenEye, I mean, come on. Games like that just stand the test of time so much that even though I may not play most of these games anymore, my memories playing with friends, playing multiplayer, I'll never forget playing GoldenEye with my grandmother, in Complex, like just weird memories like that where I sat down and played with her and taught her how to use the N64 controller. It was like such a surreal moment where even back then, Nintendo always had that draw, right? More so than other consoles of bringing family members together to play games that normally would not always touch games. But N64 just, I still think is the peak of Nintendo when it comes to first-party releases, and not just the Marios and Zeldas, but games like Wave Race, third-party titles like Bomberman 64. Let's not forget Donkey Kong 64 as well, for a first-party title. In terms of platformers, if you love 3D platformers, which I do, maybe that's one of the reasons why I've held it in such high regards, like Glover, love Glover. Gex 64, I'm a big Gex 64 fan. Just can't discount it. Even though it may be one of my least played consoles today, I still have to put it pretty high on this list because I still appreciate it, and I know it's deserving of being in the middle of the pack. All right, number 4. This one, I almost wanted to bump it up one more slot, but absolutely deserving is the Xbox 360 coming in at my number 4. Xbox 360, during that generation, with the war between the 360 and the PS3, was probably one of my most memorable times ever as a gamer. Just the war between those two consoles, the ability to easily get online and play with anybody through Xbox Live. This is back when I was playing first-person shooters all the time, playing the Call of Duty games, playing the Unreal tournaments, the Unreal Championships, playing the Xbox Live arcade games. I think one of the reasons why this is so high up on my list as well is just the memory of the small indie titles that were released on there with online multiplayer functionality, where if you bought these games on day one, you'd be on there playing, these $5-10 games online with other people, playing Uno with other people. Absolutely phenomenal experience. 1 versus 100, who remembers that? Launch day, playing Gauntlet, 4-player online multiplayer. Like, hello? It's amazing, right? Like, I think the Xbox Live Arcade doesn't get as much credit as it should. Games like Bomberman Live, right? Like, as I called it in my list of top Xbox Live Arcade games, my favorite Xbox Live Arcade game of all time. Weird games like Space Giraffe. They're just countless. Mini Golf Adventures. Oh my god, just the memories of these arcade games. And not just the arcade games, but obviously the games that were coming out during that generation. Games like Skyrim, the Call of Duty games, even though I don't play them anymore, I still have to give credit where credit is due. With those being, playing the Orange Box on 360, that was a huge deal for console players at the time, being able to play Team Fortress 2 on a console. Amazing. I eventually moved on to the PC. Goodness, RPGs like Lost Odyssey and Blue Dragon, 360 had everything for me. Even the launch was amazing. Games like Cameo and Amp 3 is another one that was sort of under the radar as a good launch title. I haven't personally played it, but I hear nothing but good things about Condemned, which I think I'll be streaming pretty soon here for one of my October months on Twitch. Call of Duty 2, oh my god, like, such just amazing launch, amazing lifelong library of games that released over the course of the life of the 360. There was just never a dry period, really, for that console. And the Xbox Live Arcade, I mean, it's just such a solid console. The Xbox Live service, worth every penny. I was a member of that for almost 10 years straight, starting with the original Xbox until I finally stopped subscribing yearly because I just slowed down on playing games online. But completely deserving, mind-blowing at the time for graphics. The leap from the Xbox to the Xbox 360 or the PS2 to the PS3, even though we're not talking about the PS3 here, we're talking about the 360, was probably one of the more significant graphical leaps. The leap from 360 to Xbox One for me just wasn't quite as significant. But anyway, number 4, Xbox 360. Coming in at number 3 is the Sega Genesis, and you guys have heard me mention over time that I grew up a Sega kid. I grew up a Genesis kid. That was like my go-to console when I go out to the stores, go out to the Funkolands and the Whizzes and the Kmarts, or wherever I was going. I was always hunting down the Sega Genesis games, and just not just the memories, but I'm still able to easily go back and play childhood favorites. Obviously, my love for gaming really started with the Genesis, thanks to Sonic 1 and 2. Playing games like that, discovering the weird library of games out there, thanks to the Sega Channel, I had Sega Channel for like a year or two, so I was able to sample so many Sega games right from my home. God, just amazing. I don't want to go off on a tangent about the Sega Channel now, but man, just put yourself in a place and time where you can pretty much play changing monthly games right from your home on the Sega Channel back in the 90s. I mean, it was, God, what a time to be alive that was. That was amazing. Very fortunate to have had the chance to play the Sega Channel. But not just the nostalgic memories of playing these games as a kid. The fact that I can still go back and play all those games that I loved as a kid without having to worry about ruining childhood memories like the N64. and being able to discover the vast library that still exists today for that system, where there's still tons of games that I would like to own and play, just makes it sort of an exciting console for me in terms of collecting and playing games. And I'm one of the lovers of the music on the Sega Genesis compared to Super Nintendo. I'm one of those weird people that prefers the gritty metallic sounds of the Genesis over the Super Nintendo. I know that's strange, but that just shows how much of a Sega kid I am, how much I love my Sega Genesis. And is it mostly due to the Sonic games on there, growing up playing them, that it's so high on my list? Maybe, because they meant so much to me back then, but it's more than that. It's just such a solid system all around, and I don't think I'd be where I am today without the Sega Genesis. So, number 3 on the list. So here's the shocker, right? Like, all these years I've been telling you guys, my number 1 system of all time was the PlayStation 2. Well, guess what? It's not my number 1 system of all time anymore. It's now number 2. For those of you that haven't watched my channel for a long time, I've always said, when people ask me, what's your favorite system of all time? PS2. That's what I used to tell them. Not anymore. It's number 2 now. So, PlayStation 2. Wow. Such an amazing library. As a fan of RPGs and platformers and weird, obscure Japanese games, the PlayStation 2 had everything. My favorite game of all time is on there, Ico. Games like Dark Cloud, heck, Shadow of the Colossus as well. Let's not forget about that. Guitar Man, Rez, SOCOM. Some of my favorite games ever are on the PS2, and that used to be a reason for me to put it as my number 1, because it was just so easy. There was so many good games, so many obscure games, such a vast library of things to collect, to play, to discover, and I still absolutely love the PS2 and the library of games, and being the first home console that let me play online and use voice chat. SOCOM, hello. What an amazing time it was to be able to play online games from my home. I never was able to get on that Bandcamp with the Dreamcast, or heck, the Saturn, which some of you were able to do as well. But it was just such a significant time to get into online gaming on the PS2, even though the selection of games maybe wasn't quite as high. Games like Final Fantasy XI, being able to play my first MMORPG on a home like, so many important games on that console. Cannot understate how amazing the console is. However, my new number 1 console of all time is the PlayStation 1. So you might say, oh, you're just a Sony fanboy. Your top 2 consoles of all time are PlayStation 1 and 2. Not a Sony fanboy. I love everything equally. Heck, I got the CDI on this list, okay? I'm not a fanboy of anything. Love everything equally. So, PlayStation 1, what made this escalate to number 1 on my list over the PlayStation 2? I think just over the years, being able to delve deeper into the library of just looking beyond. Originally, it used to be the RPG system for me, right? Like, everything on there was, like, almost my entire library were just platformers and RPGs. The Klonoas and Skull Monkeys and stuff like that, paired with the Final Fantasies and all the Squaresoft RPGs and the NX games and stuff like that. So once I started looking beyond the RPGs, that's when, and I'm not just saying I only played RPGs on the PS1, but, looking beyond my limited range of games I was familiar with, and started looking into the cheaper $5, $10 games, the weird games out there, some more of the platformers that existed on the system. Not only is it fun to collect for, because you're never going to have a period where you're looking through PS1 games and you're not going to find something that appeals to you. There's never a time where you're going to be looking through a bin of games at a convention or something, or flea market, and pull out a game and not say, oh, that looks amazing, I need that in my collection. There's always something on the PS1, and that's what makes it so appealing as a collector and a gamer, because the games, a lot of them are still cheap. Right now, there's still a lot of affordable games out there, so to be able to spend a few dollars, $3, $4, $5, $10 for a game, and if it sucks, oh well, it wasn't that expensive. But once in a while, you find some real gems in the rough, and that leads me to my next point, the thing that really took the PS1 from being just, a system with a very large library of games. The imports expanded my horizons like you guys would not believe. I have gotten in the PS1 imports like you have no idea. I think my PS1 import library is now larger than my US collection. I have hundreds of PS1 games. I went through the entire list of every Japanese PS1 game released, one by one, researching them, looking at screenshots, checking out video, to formulate a list of games that I wanted to play. So I bought pretty much everything that would be playable without knowledge of Japanese. There's still a list of games that I need, but for the most part, I have like 90% of what I want, which is hundreds of games. And I'm not just like buying them and collecting them and they're sitting on a shelf. No, I've been streaming all of these games on Twitch for the past few years. So I've gone through hundreds of Japanese PS1 imports, and there have been some absolutely phenomenal games that I've discovered on there that are super obscure. So not many people are talking about them, which is why I've never discovered them in the past. And this whole discovery process, once again bringing it back to the CDI, is quite important for me. The feeling that I can have a console where I find it just as much fun finding these games and seeing what they're all about than actually like sitting down and playing them is a very important thing for me when it comes to what consoles I enjoy the most these days. Collectability is still a very important thing for me. I'm not just buying anything and everything. I am going through the selection process of handpicking my libraries. I don't just buy a lot of games. Like some people might buy a box of 100 Japanese PS1 games and they get a whole bunch of crap they can't play. No, I handpick my games, I handpick my library, and that makes the process so much fun. And being able to share it online with people on Twitch is, it makes it even better. We can once again laugh together. We can complain together about how bad some of the games are. Discover some true gems out there. There's just too much to say. I feel like in the future I'd have to do several videos on Japanese PS1 games to really convey how good the Japanese library is. And for the most part, it's been quite affordable. It's not too expensive. It's not too crazy on the wallet because a lot of imports are under the radar and you can get them quite cheap. And I've had help over the years, acquiring certain games that might be a little difficult to get, but most of the work and heavy lifting was done by myself. Having to wait quite a long time for some of these games to pop up for sale as well. So the imports, the US games, the memories of, playing that at my grandparents' house. My grandfather had one for when I came over there. We'd sit down and I'd watch him play like Tomb Raider and Doom and Wolfenstein. He loved those kind of games. And I would go over there and, play. That was my first time playing Final Fantasy VII, and man, it was just history from there. That's kind of what really developed my love for RPGs and Final Fantasy IX, and it was just history from there, right? So yeah, it's got the nostalgia, it's got the good game library, it's got the amazing import library, it's got the discovery factor, it's got the streamability factor for me, which is really important. Cheap, affordable games that I can play and get a couple hours enjoyment out of with other people. Can't ask for more. That is why the PlayStation 1 is my new favorite console of all time. I really hope you guys enjoyed this video. Please feel free to, let me know what you think. I would actually encourage you, instead of leaving a comment below, but feel free to do so. Maybe come on over to my Twitch page where, I stream almost every day. I'll have the link in the description, twitch.tv/PeteDorr. I changed the name from Pete's Game Room to PeteDorr on Twitch. Just keep that in mind, so you might have to update some bookmarks. But yeah, I'd love to have you come over there and discuss with me in real time about my list. What would your top 10 be? I'd much rather have a one-on-one conversation with you guys on Twitch, rather than just look and read through comments on YouTube. But anyway, thanks for watching, guys. Hopefully you enjoyed, and I'll see you in a future video. I hope it won't take quite as long next time. Anyway, thanks for watching.